A divorced mom spent her last penny on an abandoned cabin, only to have her German Shepherd find something shocking. She thought she was just buying a broken-down shack in the woods. But the walls began to glow at night. And beneath the floorboards, her loyal dog uncovered a secret hidden for decades. Inside, letters from a desperate wife, a medal stained with blood, and a journal that whispered one haunting message. Protect her. She is the reason the cabin glows. What really happened in this cabin? Why was the truth buried for generations? And can a forgotten soldier's sacrifice bring healing to a family still broken by time? This isn't just a story about an abandoned cabin. It's about the discovery that changes everything. Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. The ancient minivan groaned as Rachel Thomas guided it up the steep mountain road, each curve bringing her closer to what she hoped would be a fresh start. Her knuckles were white against the worn steering wheel, and her shoulders ached from the tension of the long drive. In the rearview mirror, she caught glimpses of Ranger, her faithful German Shepherd, who sat alert in the back seat, his ears perking up at every new sound from the unfamiliar wilderness. "Almost there, boy," Rachel said softly, her voice barely audible above the engine's protests. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dancing shadows across the dashboard. Her last savings, every penny she'd managed to scrape together after the divorce, had gone into buying this cabin site unseen. It was a desperate move, she knew that. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The road narrowed, and fallen pine needles crunched under the tires. Rachel's heart skipped a beat when she finally spotted it through the trees. Her new home. The cabin stood like a forgotten sentinel in a small clearing, its weathered wooden walls nearly hidden beneath thick curtains of ivy. The sight of it made her stomach clench with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She parked the minivan and sat for a moment, letting the engine tick as it cooled. Ranger's warm breath tickled her ear as he leaned forward from the back seat, eager to explore. "Well, what do you think?" she asked him, reaching back to scratch behind his ears. His tail thumped against the seat in response. The evening air was crisp when Rachel stepped out of the van, her boots crunching on gravel. The cabin's windows stared back at her like vacant eyes, their glass clouded with years of neglect. The porch sagged slightly on one corner, and dead leaves had collected in drifts against the walls. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Walking up to the front door, Rachel fumbled with the old key she'd received in the mail. The lock was stiff, requiring her to lean her weight against the door while turning the key. With a protesting groan of rusty hinges, the door finally swung inward, releasing a rush of stale air that made her cough. Ranger pressed against her leg, his nose working overtime as they stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the beam of light from the open door, and cobwebs stretched like gray lace between the ceiling beams. The silence was absolute, broken only by their footsteps on the wooden floor and Ranger's curious sniffing. "Home sweet home," Rachel murmured, her voice sounding small in the empty space. She moved through the main room, running her fingers along a dust-covered windowsill. The furniture left behind by the previous owners was sparse: a sagging couch, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a few shelves mounted on the walls. Everything was draped in sheets that had gone gray with age. As the day's light began to fade, Rachel retrieved her camping supplies from the van. She planned ahead, knowing the cabin's utilities wouldn't be connected yet. Setting up her battery-powered lantern on the kitchen counter, she created a small circle of warm light in the growing darkness. The camping stove came next, its familiar blue flame a comfort in the unfamiliar space. Rachel stirred a pot of canned soup, the best she could manage after the long drive. Ranger sat nearby, his eyes never leaving her as she moved around the makeshift kitchen. "It's not exactly gourmet," she said, pouring the soup into a bowl. "But it's better than nothing, right?" She set aside a portion for Ranger in his travel bowl, adding some kibble from her bag. The sound of his eating filled the quiet space, making it feel a little less empty. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the wall, slowly spooning the warm soup into her mouth. Through the windows, she could see the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the mountains. The forest around the cabin grew darker, the shadows deeper. That's when she noticed it. Something odd about the walls. At first, she thought it was just her tired eyes playing tricks on her, but as full darkness settled outside, she couldn't deny what she was seeing. A faint luminescence seemed to seep from the old wood itself, as if the walls were gently breathing with their own inner light. Rachel blinked hard, then rubbed her eyes, but the subtle glow remained. Ranger lifted his head from his empty bowl, his ears forward, studying the walls with obvious interest. The sight sent a shiver down Rachel's spine, despite the relative warmth of the evening. With trembling fingers, she reached for her wallet, pulling out the worn photograph she always carried. Her daughter's smile beamed up at her, frozen in time at her 10th birthday party, taken just before everything had fallen apart. The familiar image steadied her nerves, but couldn't completely dispel her unease about the strange light. "We can do this," she whispered, touching the photo gently. "We have to." Ranger moved closer, resting his head on her knee, offering silent support. Together, they sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by the mysterious glow of their new home, while Rachel tried to convince herself that exhaustion was making her see things that couldn't possibly be real. The cabin creaked and settled around them, its aged timbers adjusting to the cooling night air. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to these walls than just old wood and peeling paint. Still, she had nowhere else to go. This was their fresh start, strange glowing walls and all. Rachel woke to the insistent sound of scratching and whining. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. For a moment, she was disoriented, her sleeping bag feeling foreign against the rough wooden boards. Then reality settled in. This was home now, for better or worse. "Ranger?" she called out, pushing herself up on her elbows. "What's wrong, boy?" The German Shepherd stood near the kitchen area, his paws working frantically at a specific spot on the floor. His whines grew more urgent when he heard her voice. "Please don't let it be mice," Rachel muttered, pulling herself up. Her muscles protested from sleeping on the hard floor. She shuffled over to where Ranger continued his determined pawing. "Or worse, rot. We can't afford repairs right now." She knelt beside him, running her hands over the weathered floorboards. They felt solid enough, though the wood was warped with age. "Come on, buddy. Let's have breakfast first, then we can check it out." But even as she prepared their simple breakfast, instant oatmeal for her and kibble for Ranger, her dog wouldn't leave the spot. He kept returning to it between bites, scratching and whining with growing intensity. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Rachel sighed, setting aside her half-finished oatmeal. She'd learned to trust Ranger's instincts over the years. During the worst days of her divorce, he'd always seemed to know when she needed comfort most. She retrieved the old toolbox from her van, another garage sale find she'd picked up knowing the cabin would need work. The crowbar was heavy in her hands as she examined the warped boards. "I really hope I'm not about to find a nest of something unpleasant." The first board resisted, then gave way with a loud crack that echoed through the quiet cabin. Rachel jumped at the sound, but Ranger's tail started wagging enthusiastically. She pried up a second board, then a third, revealing a dark cavity beneath the floor. "What in the world?" Rachel murmured, reaching for her phone to use as a flashlight. The beam illuminated something metallic, a lockbox, old and rusted but intact. It was about the size of a shoebox, tucked away in a space that looked deliberately carved out between the floor joists. With some effort, she managed to pull it free. The metal was cold against her fingers, its surface rough with rust. "Well, this is interesting," she said to Ranger, who sat watching intently, his earlier agitation replaced with curious attention. The box's latch was corroded, but gave way after some careful manipulation. Inside, protected from moisture by what looked like oilcloth, she found a small collection of items that made her breath catch. Letters, their paper yellowed with age, were bundled together with faded ribbon. A silver locket lay nestled among them, its surface tarnished but still beautiful. But it was the photograph that made Rachel's hands tremble. The black and white image showed a young woman standing beside a soldier in uniform. The picture was clearly old, the clothing suggested World War II era. But what struck Rachel was the woman's face. She found herself staring at features that could have been her own. The same high cheekbones, the same slight tilt to the eyes, even the way her hair fell across her forehead. "This is impossible," Rachel whispered, holding the photograph closer to the light, streaming through the window. Ranger pressed against her leg, offering silent support as she struggled to process what she was seeing. She spent the rest of the day trying to distract herself with unpacking and cleaning, but her eyes kept returning to the lockbox and its mysterious contents. The letters remained unopened. Something about them felt too intimate to read in the harsh light of day. As night fell, Rachel set up her lantern again and settled into her sleeping bag. Ranger curled up beside her as she carefully lifted the photograph once more. The lantern light cast a warm glow over the image, making it seem almost alive. "Why do you look like me?" she whispered to the woman in the photograph. Her fingers traced the familiar yet strange features, searching for differences but finding mainly similarities. The cabin walls seemed to respond to her words, their strange luminescence pulsing faintly in the darkness. Rachel pulled her sleeping bag tighter around herself, shivering despite the mild temperature. The glow was stronger tonight, she was sure of it, as if the cabin itself was acknowledging the discovery she'd made. She lay there in the growing darkness, the photograph held close to her chest, while the walls continued their gentle, inexplicable radiance. Ranger's steady breathing beside her was the only normal thing in a moment that felt increasingly surreal. The mystery of the woman in the photograph, this stranger with her face, would not let her rest, but the answers would have to wait until morning. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees as Rachel made her way down the winding mountain road toward town. Her muscles ached from sleeping on the floor, and her mind still buzzed with questions about the photograph. The general store's faded red awning came into view as she rounded the final bend, its windows displaying a jumbled array of basic supplies and local crafts. A bell jingled as she pushed open the door, the cool air inside a welcome relief from the summer heat. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she gathered basic supplies. Cleaning materials, some canned goods, and a few fresh items from the small produce section. At the counter, a plump woman with gray-streaked hair rang up her items. Rachel pulled out her wallet, pausing before asking, "Do you know anything about the old Carter cabin?" "I just bought it." The woman's hand stilled on the register. Several other customers turned to look, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, concern, maybe. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "The Carter place?" the cashier finally said, her voice careful. "Hasn't been lived in for years, decades, really." "Well, it needs some work, but it's home now," Rachel replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. She noticed how the other customers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads slightly. After paying, Rachel stepped out into the sunlight, her arms full of grocery bags. She had only taken a few steps when a gravelly voice spoke behind her. "You're the one who bought Helen's place." Rachel turned to find an elderly man watching her. His weathered face was partially hidden beneath a worn baseball cap, and his clothes showed signs of hard outdoor work. Despite his age, he stood straight and tall, his eyes sharp as they studied her. "I'm Edgar," he said, not offering his hand. "Live about a quarter-mile down from you." "Rachel Thomas," she replied. "Nice to meet you." Edgar seemed to consider his next words carefully. "That place," he said finally, "don't stay empty long. People always come back to it." His tone carried a weight that made Rachel's skin prickle. "Seen 3 families move in over the years. None stayed more than a season." "Well, I plan to break that pattern," Rachel said. But Edgar's words had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. He gave her a long look. "Maybe you will. Maybe you're supposed to." Before she could ask what it meant, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing there with her groceries and a growing sense of unease. The walk back to the cabin seemed longer, her mind churning with Edgar's cryptic warning. The grocery bags grew heavier with each step, but it wasn't just their physical weight that bore down on her. It was the mounting questions about what exactly she'd bought with her last savings. Back at the cabin, after putting away the supplies, Rachel sat cross-legged on her sleeping bag and carefully untied the ribbon binding the letters she'd found. The paper was delicate, threatening to crumble at the edges. The first envelope was addressed simply, "My dearest James." Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was elegant but urgent, the ink faded to a warm brown. "My darling husband, our beautiful daughter was born yesterday on April 12th, 1943. I wish you could see her, James. She has your mother's eyes and the sweetest smile I've ever seen. I've named her Margaret, just as we discussed. Please come home to us. I know you're fighting for something bigger than ourselves, but our baby needs her father. Every day I pray for your safe return. The cabin feels so empty without you, though the townspeople have been kind. Mrs. Sullivan from the general store brings me fresh bread, and old Mr. Peterson helps with firewood. But at night, when Margaret is sleeping, the silence is almost too much to bear. Write when you can. Know that we love you, and we're waiting. Forever yours, Helen." Rachel had to pause, her vision blurring with unexpected tears. More letters followed, each one more desperate than the last, as Helen Carter pleaded with her husband to return home to meet their daughter. The final letter was dated October 1944, its tone taking on a frantic edge, as Helen described strange occurrences in the cabin. Unexplained lights, odd sounds in the walls. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Rachel looked up to see dark clouds gathering over the mountains. The storm rolled in quickly, bringing with it an early darkness that filled the cabin with shadows. As the rain began to fall, pattering against the roof in a steady rhythm, Rachel noticed something strange. The walls were beginning to glow again, but stronger than before. The ethereal light seemed to pulse with the thunder, creating shifting patterns across the old wood. Lightning flashed, and in that brief, brilliant illumination, Rachel saw something she hadn't noticed before. There were carvings in the wooden beams, initials and dates, dozens of them, some so faint they were barely visible. But in the strange, ambient glow emanating from the walls, they seemed to shimmer. She moved closer to one beam, squinting in the dim light. J, C, plus H, C. 1942 was carved inside a rough heart. Below it, in different handwriting, M, C, 1965. More dates and initials followed, creating a timeline of sorts in the ancient wood. The storm intensified outside, but Rachel barely noticed. She was too absorbed in the glowing carvings, each one a piece of the cabin's history, each set of initials a story waiting to be uncovered. The mysterious light made them dance before her eyes, as if the very walls of the cabin were trying to tell her something. The storm unleashed its full fury over the mountain, rattling the cabin's windows with each thunderous boom. Rachel huddled near her battery-powered lantern, still studying the mysterious carvings when Ranger's behavior suddenly changed. His ears perked up, and he turned sharply toward the old stone fireplace. The German Shepherd's bark echoed through the cabin, startling Rachel. It wasn't his usual alert bark. This was different, more urgent. He paced in front of the fireplace, his nails clicking against the wooden floor, before barking again with increasing intensity. "What is it, boy?" Rachel asked, setting down Helen's. Letters. Ranger's response was to scratch at the base of the fireplace, his actions becoming more frantic. Lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes as Rachel approached. The fireplace was crude but solid, built from local stone that had blackened with decades of use. Ranger focused his attention on one particular stone near the bottom, pawing at it repeatedly. Rachel knelt beside him, running her fingers over the rough surface. The stone seemed slightly different from its neighbors, not quite as firmly set. When she pressed against it, she felt a slight give. "Stand back, buddy," she told Ranger, who reluctantly moved aside but kept whining softly. Using all her strength, Rachel wiggled the stone back and forth. It gradually loosened, and with one final push, it came free. Behind it lay a dark cavity, roughly the size of a shoebox. The mysterious glow from the walls seemed to intensify, as if responding to the discovery. Rachel's heart pounded as she reached into the space. Her fingers brushed against something metal, then leather. Carefully, she withdrew the objects. A tarnished military medal, its ribbon faded and frayed. A leather-bound journal, its pages stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. And several fragments of olive-drab fabric that crumbled slightly at her touch. Thunder crashed overhead as Rachel opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were water-damaged and warped, making some entries illegible, but others remained clear enough to read. The handwriting was different from Helen's, stronger, more hurried. The first readable entry was dated June 19, 1944. "Made it home on leave, but something's wrong. The cabin isn't just a cabin anymore. Helen tries to hide it, but I can see the fear in her eyes when she talks about the lights in the walls. Margaret is beautiful. God, how she glows when she laughs. But there's something else glowing too. Something that shouldn't be." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through more pages, finding scattered entries that mentioned strange occurrences. Unexplained phenomena centered around the cabin and baby Margaret. The writer's tone grew increasingly desperate, mixing love with fear. Then she reached the final entry. The page was heavily stained, the writing unsteady but determined. "If anyone finds this, protect her. She is the reason the cabin glows. I don't understand how or why, but Margaret is connected to this place in ways I never thought possible. Helen thinks it's a blessing, but I've seen too much in the war to believe in simple blessings anymore. Whatever power lives in these walls, it chose my daughter. I have to go back to the front tomorrow. God help me. I don't want to leave them, but duty calls. If I don't make it back." The entry ended there, the last words trailing off into a shaky line. Rachel sat back on her heels, stunned. This was James Carter's journal, Helen's husband, Margaret's father. The mysterious glow, the strange energy she'd felt since arriving, somehow it all centered around their daughter. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room. Rachel picked up the medal, turning it over in her hands. It was a Purple Heart, awarded for wounds received in combat. The name engraved on the back read James C. Carter. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. She felt like an intruder, disturbing secrets that had lain hidden for decades. The medal seemed to grow heavier in her palm, as if carrying the burden of its owner's sacrifice. "What happened to you?" she whispered into the storm-filled darkness. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The glow that had been pulsing faintly in the walls suddenly intensified, flooding the room with an otherworldly light. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but soft and encompassing, like moonlight through water. The light seemed to emanate from every board, every beam, transforming the cabin into a luminous chamber. Rachel remained frozen in place, the medal clutched tightly in her hand as the supernatural radiance washed over her. Ranger pressed against her leg, not in fear but in solidarity, as if he too understood the significance of what they'd uncovered. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, time seemed to stand still in that ethereal light. Rachel knew she'd stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple property purchase. This cabin, with its hidden compartments and mysterious glow, held secrets that spanned generations, secrets that somehow seemed to be reaching out to her specifically. The morning sun broke through dissipating storm clouds, casting dappled light on puddles that dotted the mountain road. Rachel gripped the steering wheel of her minivan, her mind still churning with everything she'd discovered the night before. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, his ears perking up whenever they hit a bump in the road. "We need answers, boy," Rachel said, glancing at the German Shepherd. "Real answers, not just pieces of an old puzzle." The small-town library was housed in a brick building that had clearly seen better days, but its worn steps and faded sign held a certain charm. Rachel parked in the nearly empty lot, promising Ranger she'd return soon. He watched her through the window with those knowing eyes of his. Inside, the library smelled of old books and furniture polish. An elderly librarian with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from her desk, offering a gentle smile. "Can I help you find anything?" she asked. "Yes, please," Rachel said. "I'm looking for information about someone who lived here during World War II. James Carter?" The librarian's smile faded slightly. "The Carter case. That's quite a story. Local history section is in the back corner. We keep the newspaper archives there too." Rachel thanked her and made her way through the quiet stacks. The local history section was small but well organized, with boxes of stacks of school, carefully preserved newspapers, and town records. She pulled out the first box labeled 1940 through 1945 and began her search. The first mention of James Carter appeared in a 1942 article about local men joining the war effort. There he was, in a grainy photograph, standing proud in his uniform, his arm around a young woman Rachel recognized from the photo in the lockbox, Helen. The caption read, "Local newlyweds James and Helen Carter bid farewell as Private Carter departs for basic training." Rachel's throat tightened. She knew that look of brave faces hiding breaking hearts. She'd worn it herself when signing divorce papers, trying to stay strong for her daughter. More articles followed James's service, promotions, a citation for bravery, letters home published in the local paper. Then, in late 1945, everything changed. The headline made Rachel's heart skip. "Local soldier missing in action. Private First Class James Carter, last seen near German border." She dug deeper, finding follow-up articles that painted an increasingly complex picture. No body was ever recovered. No definitive explanation was given. But then she found something that made her blood run cold. A small article dated 6 months after James was declared missing. Questions surround Carter disappearance. Fellow soldiers report strange behavior before vanishing. The article quoted anonymous sources, suggesting James had been acting erratically in his final days, speaking of impossible things and expressing desperate concerns about his family back home. Some suggested he had deserted, unable to cope with the pressures of war. "That's not the whole story," Rachel whispered to herself, thinking of the journal hidden in the cabin. The man who wrote those pages wasn't running away. He was terrified of something specific, something connected to his daughter and that strange glow. She made copies of every article she could find, her hands shaking slightly as she operated the ancient copy machine. The more she read, the more parallel she saw between James's story and her own past. A parent torn away from their child, leaving unanswered questions behind. Her ex-husband had chosen to leave, pursuing a new life with his young secretary. He'd abandoned their daughter without a backward glance, leaving Rachel to pick up the pieces. But James Carter, something told her his disappearance wasn't so simple. The librarian appeared beside her as she was gathering her copies. "Find what you were looking for?" Rachel hesitated. "Sort of. Did you know the Carters?" The older woman nodded slowly. "I was just a girl, but I remember the talk. Helen Carter nearly went mad with grief, insisting James would never desert. She claimed the cabin knew something we didn't. Crazy talk, everyone said. She raised that little girl Margaret, all alone. Margaret? Rachel's heart jumped at the name from the journal. Do you know what happened to her? Last I heard, she was in a nursing home over in Milton. Never married, never left the area. Folks say she's still waiting for answers about her daddy. Rachel thanked the librarian and hurried back to her van. Ranger greeted her with a gentle whine, nosing at the stack of papers in her hands. You won't believe what I found, boy, she said, starting the engine. James Carter didn't just disappear. He was afraid of something. Something about Margaret and that cabin. And Margaret's still alive. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of racing thoughts. Rachel's mind kept circling back to her own daughter. How she'd promised herself she'd never let their story be defined by abandonment. Now here she was, drawn into another family's tale of loss and unanswered questions. Back at the cabin, Rachel spread everything out on the kitchen table. The worn letters from the lockbox, the silver locket, James's blood-stained journal, and now the newspaper articles that added new layers to the mystery. Ranger sat beside her, his chin resting on her knee. The morning light filtered through the windows, making the cabin's strange glow nearly invisible. But Rachel could still feel it, a subtle energy that seemed to pulse through the very walls. She ran her fingers over James's final journal entry, thinking about Margaret out there somewhere, still wondering about her father after all these years. We're not leaving until we solve this, she whispered to Ranger, who thumped his tail in agreement. The cabin's mysteries had chosen her, just as surely as they had once chosen the Carter family. And Rachel Thomas didn't give up easily, not when justice and healing hung in the balance. Rachel's hands trembled as she dialed the number she'd found for Dr. Martin Wells. After 3 rings, a warm, scholarly voice answered. Dr. Wells speaking. Hello, Dr. Wells. My name is Rachel Thomas. I'm calling about a World War II soldier named James Carter. I understand you've studied local veterans? There was a pause. Then the voice sharpened with interest. James Carter? Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. What's your connection? Rachel explained about buying the cabin and finding the hidden items. Dr. Wells listened intently, occasionally making thoughtful sounds. This is fascinating, he said finally. Would you be willing to bring these items to my home office? I'd very much like to examine them. An hour later, Rachel pulled up to a modest brick house on the outskirts of town. The front yard was neat, but lived in, with weathered bird feeders and overgrown rose bushes. Dr. Wells met her at the door, a tall man in his 70s with white hair and alert blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Come in, he said, leading her through the house to his study. The room took Rachel's breath away. Every wall was lined with bookshelves, and display cases held military artifacts, medals, patches, old photographs. A large desk dominated the center, covered in papers and manila folders. Please, have a seat, Doctor, Wells said, clearing some books from a comfortable armchair. Now, show me what you've found. Rachel carefully removed the journal and medal from her bag. Dr. Wells handled them with reverence, examining the journal's worn leather cover and blood-stained pages through a magnifying glass. Extraordinary, he murmured. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, all consistent with the period. He looked up at Rachel. Where exactly did you find these? She described the hidden compartments in the cabin. Dr. Wells nodded, making notes in a small notebook. James Carter was quite well known in these parts during the war, he said. Distinguished service record, multiple commendations. His letters home were regularly published in the local paper to boost morale. He stood and went to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. I've collected everything I could find about him over the years. He spread photographs and newspaper clippings across his desk. Rachel recognized some from her library research, but others were new to her. One showed James in his uniform, standing proud and tall beside his commanding officer. Another captured him with his unit, grinning and throwing an arm around a fellow soldier's shoulders. The interesting thing about Carter's case, Dr. Wells continued, is how quickly public opinion turned after his disappearance. One day, he was a hero, the next a deserter. But the evidence never quite added up. Rachel leaned forward. What do you mean? Well, for one thing, his last known location, Dr. Wells pulled out a yellowed map. He vanished near the German border in 1945, just weeks before the war ended. But according to military records, his unit wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that area. And then there's this. He showed her a document, a military intelligence report marked confidential. It took me years to get this declassified, he said. 3 other soldiers from Carter's unit also disappeared that week. All of them reported seeing strange lights in the woods the night before they vanished. The official investigation was suddenly closed without explanation. Rachel's skin prickled as she thought of the cabin's mysterious glow. Dr. Wells, there's something else you should know. She told him about the cabin's luminescence, watching his expression carefully. To her relief, he didn't dismiss her story. Fascinating, he said again, more quietly this time. You know, Helen Carter made similar claims after James disappeared. She insisted the cabin was trying to tell her something about his fate. Everyone thought grief had driven her mad. He picked up the medal again, turning it over in his hands. This is a Silver Star, awarded for gallantry in action. James received it for saving his entire squad during an ambush. The man was no coward, Miss Thomas. Rachel swallowed hard. His daughter, Margaret. Do you know what happened to her? Margaret Carter? Dr. Wells nodded. She's still alive, living in Milton Care Center. I visited her a few times over the years for my research, but she was always reluctant to discuss her father. He hesitated. It's a painful subject for her. She grew up believing he had abandoned her and her mother. I need to talk to her, Rachel said firmly. She deserves to know what we've found. Doctor? Wells studied her face. May I ask why this matters so much to you? Rachel pulled out her wallet and showed him the photo of her daughter. Because I know what it's like to raise a child alone, wondering how to explain why someone left. But James Carter didn't choose to leave. I'm sure of it. His last journal entry, he was trying to protect his daughter from something. The historian was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. Sometimes the truth belongs to the family, not history books. Margaret deserves to know her father didn't desert them. He wrote down the nursing home's address and contact information. Be gentle with her, he advised. She's had decades to build up walls around this pain. Rachel gathered the items carefully, thanking Dr. Wells for his help. As she stood to leave, he touched her arm. Miss Thomas? Whatever happened to James Carter, I believe it was something extraordinary. The official story never made sense. Perhaps you're meant to finally uncover the truth. Outside in her van, Rachel stared at the old photograph of Helen and James Carter. Their faces seemed to come alive in the afternoon light, young, in love, unaware of the tragedy ahead. I'll find her, Rachel whispered, tracing James's familiar features. The mystery of his disappearance and the cabin's strange glow felt more connected than ever. Whatever the truth was, Margaret Carter deserved to know it. The Milton Care Center stood nestled among tall pine trees, its red brick walls weathered but well-maintained. Rachel sat in her van for several minutes, gathering her courage. The items from the cabin lay carefully wrapped in her bag. The photograph, the letters, the journal that might finally reveal the truth about James Carter. Taking a deep breath, she walked through the automatic doors into a lobby that smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee. At the front desk, a young nurse looked up with a practiced smile. I'm here to see Margaret Carter, Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. Oh, Miss Carter? She's in the garden room. Are you family? Rachel hesitated. No, but I have something important to show her. About her father. The nurse's smile faded slightly. Miss Carter doesn't get many visitors. Please be gentle with her. She's had a difficult week. Following the nurse's directions, Rachel walked down a sunlit hallway decorated with watercolor paintings. She found the garden room easily, a glass-walled space filled with potted plants and comfortable chairs. An elderly woman sat alone by the window, her thin hands folded in her lap as she watched birds at a feeder outside. "Mrs. Carter?" Rachel's voice came out softer than she intended. The woman turned, her blue eyes sharp and alert despite her age. "Miss Carter," she corrected quietly. "I never married. I'm Rachel Thomas. I recently bought your family's cabin." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on the arms of her chair. "That old place? It should have been torn down years ago." Rachel pulled up a chair beside her. "I found something there. Several things, actually, hidden in the walls and under the floors." "Whatever you found, you can keep it," Margaret said firmly. "I want nothing to do with that cabin." "Please," Rachel said. "Just look at this one thing. Then if you want me to leave, I will." She carefully withdrew the photograph from her bag, holding it out. Margaret glanced at it dismissively, then froze. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. That's my mother," she whispered. Her fingers brushed the image of the young woman's face. "And," her voice caught, "and my father." Rachel watched as tears welled in Margaret's eyes, spilling down her weathered cheeks. The elderly woman's composure cracked, decades of carefully maintained walls crumbling as she stared at her parents' young, hopeful faces. "I was just a baby when this was taken," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "He left for the war right after. Mother used to tell me he was coming home, that he'd be so proud to see how I'd grown." She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her pocket. "But he never came back. Never even wrote to explain why." "What did your mother tell you about him?" Rachel asked gently. Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Nothing. After they declared him missing, she never spoke of him again. Packed away all his things, all their photos. When people whispered that he'd deserted, run off with someone else, she just went quiet, like he'd never existed." Rachel pulled out Helen's letters next. "I found these too. Your mother wrote them while your father was away." Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded the first letter. "My dearest James," she read aloud. "Our beautiful daughter has your eyes. She smiles, just like you." Her voice broke. "I never knew these existed. Mother must have hidden them away with everything else." "There's more," Rachel said softly, showing her the journal and medal. "Your father wrote this. His last entry. He wasn't a deserter, Margaret. Something happened to him. Something he was trying to protect you from." The elderly woman touched the silver star with trembling fingers. "All these years," she whispered. "All these years I believed what everyone said, that he abandoned us, that he was a coward." Fresh tears fell. "I was so angry at him. Even after Mother died, I couldn't let go of that anger." Rachel hesitated, then asked, "Did your mother ever mention anything strange about the cabin? Any unusual occurrences?" Margaret looked up sharply. "The lights, you mean? In the walls? You knew about them?" "I remember Mother talking about them, near the end. I thought it was just her grief, her mind slipping." Margaret's voice grew distant. "She kept saying the cabin was trying to tell her something about Father. That's when I moved her here, where she could be cared for properly." Rachel leaned forward. "I've seen the lights too, Margaret. They're real, and I think they're connected to whatever happened to your father." The elderly woman was quiet for a long time, studying the photograph again. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. "Why does it matter to you?" Rachel pulled out her wallet, showing Margaret the picture of her daughter. "Because I know what it's like to raise a child alone, to see the hurt in their eyes when they ask about their father. But your father, he didn't choose to leave. These letters, his journal, they show how much he loved you and your mother." Margaret touched Rachel's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "If you uncover the truth," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you'll give me back something I lost 70 years ago. Not just my father's memory, but my mother's too. She was never the same after he disappeared." Rachel squeezed the elderly woman's hand. "I promise you, Margaret, I'll find out what really happened to your father." They sat together in the peaceful garden room, surrounded by growing things and filtered sunlight. Margaret held the photograph of her parents close to her heart, while Rachel silently vowed to unravel the mystery that had shadowed 3 generations of the Carter family. "Tell me everything," Margaret said finally. "Tell me what you found in the cabin. I want to know it all, even if it hurts. I've lived with pain for 70 years. Maybe it's time for some truth instead." The night settled around the cabin like a heavy blanket, broken only by the strange ethereal glow that seemed to pulse from within its very walls. Rachel sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, her flashlight beam dancing across the carved initials she'd noticed earlier. Now, studying them more closely, she realized they weren't random marks left by passing visitors. "HC," she whispered, tracing the letters with her fingertip. Next to it, J.C., and below them both, a smaller MC carved with delicate precision. Helen, James, and Margaret Carter, a family's legacy etched into the cabin's bones. Ranger padded over, his nails clicking against the floorboards. He pressed his warm body against her side, offering silent comfort as she examined the carvings more carefully. The initials glowed with a faint blue-green luminescence, catching the light in an unnatural way. Rachel ran her fingers over the surface again, feeling the texture. "It's not just wood," she murmured. Reaching into her backpack, she pulled out her phone and quickly searched the local geology. Her breath caught as she found what she was looking for. The mountains were known for deposits of phosphorescent resin, a naturally glowing substance that local craftsmen had used for generations. James hadn't just carved their initials. He'd filled them with the glowing resin from the mountains, a permanent marker of their presence, their connection to this place. The locket lay heavy in her palm as she picked it up again. She'd examined it earlier, but hadn't noticed the slight bulge in its rim. Working carefully with her fingernail, Rachel managed to pry open a hidden compartment within the silver casing. A folded piece of paper, yellow with age and creased almost to breaking, fell into her lap. Her hands trembled as she carefully unfolded it, revealing cramped handwriting that matched the journal entries she'd found earlier. "My dearest Helen," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet cabin. "If you find this, know that I tried. God knows, I tried to make it back to you and our Margaret." Rachel's throat tightened as she continued reading. James described being wounded in battle, taking a bullet to his leg that never properly healed. He'd been separated from his unit during a fierce firefight, ending up behind enemy lines. "The pain makes me weak," he'd written, his words slanting across the page, as if written in great distress. "Some days, I can barely walk. But I think of you both, of our little girl growing up without knowing my face, and I force myself to keep moving. I'm trying to make it home to you, my love. Even if I have to crawl every mile." Tears blurred Rachel's vision as she read the final lines. "If I don't make it, please forgive my weakness. Know that every step I took was toward you. Every breath I drew was with your names on my lips. The cabin will show you. I made it glow like a beacon, hoping it would guide you home when I no longer could." Rachel pressed the letter to her chest, her heart aching for this man she'd never met. This father who'd fought so hard to return to his family. The official records had it wrong. James Carter hadn't deserted his family, he died trying to reach them. Looking around the cabin with new understanding, she saw how the glow seemed to concentrate around the carved initials, spreading outward like ripples on water. James must have spent his final days here, gathering the phosphorescent resin from the mountains, working it into the wood of his family's home, creating a lasting testament to his love and devotion. "You didn't abandon them," Rachel whispered into the glowing darkness, tears streaming down her face. "You tried to come home." Ranger whined softly and pressed closer, resting his head on her knee. His warm presence anchored her as the cabin's glow seemed to intensify, surrounding them in a gentle, ethereal light. It wasn't frightening anymore. It was beautiful, a father's final gift to the family he died trying to reach. Rachel stroked Ranger's fur, letting her tears fall freely. Tomorrow she would show Margaret the letter, help her understand that her father had loved her until his last breath. But for now, she sat in the glowing cabin, bearing witness to a love strong enough to transcend death itself, leaving its mark in light and memory for those who needed to find their way home. The phosphorescent glow pulsed gently around them, like a heartbeat in the walls, as if the cabin itself was keeping alive the story of James Carter's final journey home. Ranger curled protectively beside her, his steady presence a comfort in the luminous night, as Rachel wept for a family torn apart by war and a father's love that never died. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when the sound of tires on gravel jolted Rachel from her thoughts. Through the cabin's dusty window, she watched a sleek black car wind its way up the narrow path, looking entirely out of place among the wild mountain greenery. Ranger lifted his head from his paw, ears perking up as the car door opened. Rachel's heart skipped when a man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of a corporate boardroom, complete with a leather briefcase that probably cost more than her old minivan. "Miss Thomas?" he called out, adjusting his tie as he approached the cabin. "I'm Andrew Barrett from Mountain Vista Development Corporation." Rachel stepped onto the warm porch, suddenly conscious of her wrinkled clothes and messy hair. Ranger positioned himself protectively at her side. "Yes, that's me. What can I help you with?" Barrett's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here regarding some ownership complications with this property." He pulled documents from his briefcase. "There appear to be some irregularities in the chain of title that need to be addressed." Rachel's stomach dropped. "I have the deed right here. I bought this cabin legally." "Yes, well," Barrett said, shuffling through his papers. "Our research shows overlapping claims dating back to 1945. The original owner's disappearance created quite a mess, legally speaking." He glanced at the cabin's weathered exterior with barely concealed disdain. "Mountain Vista has plans to develop this entire ridge into luxury vacation homes. This structure would need to be demolished." The word demolished hit Rachel like a physical blow. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "This cabin has historical significance. James Carter was a World War II veteran who died trying to return to his family." Barrett's eyebrows rose slightly. "Can you prove that? Because without documented historical value, this is just another abandoned building standing in the way of progress." Rachel thought of the glowing walls, the carved initials, James's final message to his family. "Give me time to gather evidence." "There are artifacts, letters, Miss Thomas," Barrett interrupted, his tone patronizing. "I understand you've invested in this property. But Mountain Vista has very deep pockets and excellent lawyers. We're prepared to offer you fair market value for the cabin." "It's not about the money," Rachel insisted, feeling tears threatening but refusing to let them fall. "This place matters. It tells an important story." Barrett checked his expensive watch. "You have 2 weeks to provide concrete evidence of historical significance. After that, our lawyers will proceed with the title dispute." He handed her a business card. "I suggest you consider our offer carefully." As he turned to leave, Rachel called after him. "What about the family? The daughter is still alive." He paused briefly. "Emotional appeals won't stop progress, Miss Thomas. We need legal standing." With that, He got back into his car and drove away, leaving Rachel standing on the porch, her hands shaking. Inside, Rachel paced the cabin's main room, her mind racing. The thought of this place being demolished made her physically ill. It wasn't just about having somewhere to live anymore. This cabin held James Carter's last message to his family, his final act of love preserved in glowing resin and hidden letters. She began gathering everything they'd found. The rusted lockbox, the weathered journal with its heartbreaking entries, the blood-stained fabric, the war medal that proved James's service. Each letter from Helen was carefully collected, their papers so fragile she hardly dared touch them. The silver locket caught the morning light as she added it to the growing collection of evidence. Rachel spread everything out on the kitchen table, trying to see it through a historian's eyes. Would it be enough? Could these pieces of one family's tragedy save their home from being erased? Ranger watched her from his spot by the fireplace, his brown eyes following her movements. He'd led her to these discoveries, as if he'd somehow known how important they would be. Now, these artifacts might be their only chance to preserve James Carter's legacy. She thought of Margaret in the care home, finally learning the truth about her father after 70 years of believing he'd abandoned them. How could she tell her that the place where her father had died trying to return to his family would be knocked down to build vacation homes? Running her fingers over James's final letter, Rachel felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about finding a new home anymore. This was about protecting a soldier's last testament, preserving a family's truth, and honoring a love strong enough to make walls glow. "This is more than my home," she whispered to Ranger, who had padded over to rest his head against her leg. "It's his story." Ranger's tail thumped against the floor in response, and Rachel squared her shoulders. She had 2 weeks to prove this cabin's worth to people who only saw dollar signs. 2 weeks to fight for a dead soldier's legacy and his daughter's right to know where her father had spent his final days. The morning light caught the glowing resin in the walls, making the carved initials shimmer. Rachel touched them gently, feeling the smooth indentations James had left behind. "I won't let them erase you," she promised softly. "Your story deserves to be told." Rachel's hands trembled as she arranged the artifacts on the polished oak table in the Historical Society's conference room. The blood-stained journal, the tarnished war medal, the fragile letters, each item told part of James Carter's story. Behind her, Dr. Martin Wells adjusted his glasses, reviewing his notes one final time. The room felt imposing with its dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced historical figures lining the walls. 5 board members sat across the table, their expressions carefully neutral as they examined the items Rachel had laid out. "These artifacts were found hidden in the cabin," Rachel explained, her voice stronger than she expected. "They tell the story of James Carter, a soldier who never gave up trying to return to his family." Martha Stevenson, the board's chairwoman, picked up one of Helen's letters with white-gloved hands. "While these items are certainly interesting, Miss Thomas, we need more than personal effects to justify historical preservation status." Dr. Wells stepped forward, his academic presence commanding attention. "If I may, the historical significance extends beyond these physical items. James Carter was part of the 357th Infantry Division, decorated for valor in France. His disappearance has been a mystery that's haunted this community for decades." He carefully opened the journal to its final entry. This journal proves he didn't desert, as rumors claimed. He was wounded, struggling to make it home to his wife and infant daughter. The phosphorescent resin he used to mark the cabin walls, a local material that creates that distinctive glow, shows his determination to create a beacon for his family. The board members exchanged glances, but Rachel could see uncertainty in their eyes. This was history to them, distant, academic. They needed to understand the human story. A soft knock at the door made everyone turn. Margaret Carter stood in the doorway, supported by her nurse. Despite her frail appearance, She carried herself with quiet dignity. Rachel hurried to help her to a chair. "I'm Margaret Carter," she said, her voice thin but clear. "That soldier you're discussing, he was my father." The room fell completely silent. Margaret reached for the photograph of Helen and James, her fingers trembling as she traced their faces. "For 70 years, I believed my father abandoned us," Margaret continued. "My mother never spoke of him again. She carried that pain until she died." She looked up at the board members, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But he never abandoned us. He died trying to come home to us." Martha Stevenson leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, how do you know this? For certain?" "Because of her." Margaret gestured to Rachel. "She found my father's last messages, preserved in that cabin all these years. The glowing walls, time, he made those for me. His baby girl he never got to meet. He carved our initials there, filled them with mountain resin so they would shine like stars." Rachel watched the board members' faces soften as Margaret spoke. This wasn't just about preserving an old cabin anymore. It was about honoring a father's love, a soldier's sacrifice, a family's truth finally coming to light. "Doctor?" Wells cleared his throat. "The historical value here isn't just in the artifacts or the building itself. It's in the story they tell together, about war, about sacrifice, about the lengths people will go to return to those they love. James Carter's cabin is a testament to the human cost of war and the endurance of family bonds. The developer plans to demolish it in 2 weeks." Rachel added quietly, "If that happens, we lose not just a piece of history, but a father's final message to his daughter." Martha Stevenson studied the journal again, then looked at her fellow board members. After a moment of silent communication, she straightened in her chair. "The Historical Society agrees to conduct a full review for historical preservation status," she announced. "Given the unique nature of this case and the time constraints, we'll expedite the process." Relief flooded through Rachel so strongly she had to grip the table's edge. "Doctor." Wells smiled, nodding in satisfaction. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, wiping her eyes. "Thank you for giving my father a chance to be remembered properly." As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their things, Margaret reached for Rachel's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who looked so fragile. "He's coming home, through you," Margaret whispered, her eyes shining. "After all these years, my father is finally coming home." Rachel squeezed her hand gently, understanding that sometimes home isn't just a place. It's the truth about where you belong and who loved you enough to never stop trying to return. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as Rachel's car wound its way up the mountain road. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, holding the war medal carefully in her lap, her weathered fingers tracing its edges. The drive from the Historical Society meeting had been mostly quiet, both women lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired. When they reached the cabin, Rachel helped Margaret up the creaking porch steps. The older woman paused at the threshold, taking a deep breath. "I never thought I'd stand in my father's home," she said softly. Inside, the cabin felt different, somehow, warmer, more alive. The usual faint glow from the walls seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat. Margaret moved slowly through the main room, touching the furniture, the walls, taking in every detail with glistening eyes. "Here," Rachel said, guiding her to the fireplace. "This should be the perfect spot." Margaret lifted the medal with trembling hands and placed it carefully on the wooden mantel. As soon as it touched the surface, she began to weep, quiet tears rolling down her cheeks. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm sorry I ever doubted you." The glow in the wooden beams intensified, spreading across the ceiling in gentle waves of light. It wasn't harsh or eerie. Instead, it felt comforting, like a warm embrace. Rachel put her arm around Margaret's shoulders as they watched the phenomenon. "Do you feel that?" Margaret asked, wiping her eyes. "It's like he's here with us." "I think he is," Rachel replied softly. I think he's finally at peace, knowing you know the truth." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the play of light across the walls, until the sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Rachel's heart lifted. Her daughter was early for their weekend visit. 14-year-old Emma burst through the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the glowing walls. Ranger bounded over to greet her with enthusiastic tail wagging. "Mom?" Emma said, looking around in wonder. "The walls, they're actually glowing. I thought you were exaggerating in your texts." Rachel smiled. "Come meet someone special, honey. This is Margaret Carter. Her father built this cabin." As Rachel explained the story to her daughter, Emma's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement. She looked at the metal on the mantel, then at the glowing walls, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Mom," she said slowly, "maybe this place really was meant for us. It's like it was waiting for someone who would understand." Rachel pulled her daughter close, feeling tears prick at her own eyes. Margaret reached out and took both their hands, creating a circle of 3 generations connected by an old cabin story. They settled in front of the fireplace as evening fell, Ranger sprawling contentedly at their feet. The cabin's glow enveloped them in its gentle light, while Margaret shared stories of her mother Helen, and Rachel talked about their plans to restore the cabin. Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, occasionally reaching down to scratch Ranger's ears. The room was filled with warmth, light, and something more. The feeling of belonging, of a family's legacy preserved, of a home that had finally found its people. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine as people gathered outside the Carter cabin on a bright autumn morning. A bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight, newly mounted beside the front door, officially marking the site's historical significance. Rachel stood on the porch, watching as locals filtered through the yard, many carrying flowers or small mementos of their own fallen soldiers. Inside, the cabin had been carefully restored, its weathered walls now telling stories through carefully arranged displays. The lockbox, letters, and James Carter's journal occupied a place of honor near the fireplace, protected behind glass, but visible to all who came to learn and remember. Margaret Carter sat in a cushioned rocking chair by the window, her thin frame wrapped in a warm shawl. Though her body had grown frailer over the past weeks, her eyes sparkled with renewed life. She reached out to touch the hands of visitors who came to share their own family stories of war and loss, offering gentle words of understanding. "My father was a hero," she told each one, her voice soft but firm. "Not because he died in battle, but because he never stopped trying to come home to us." Rachel moved through the crowd, answering questions and sharing the cabin's story. She paused near the fireplace, where James's medal still held its place of honor on the mantel. The wood's phosphorescent glow had become a local legend, drawing curious visitors from neighboring towns. But for those who knew the truth, it remained a father's eternal beacon of love. Through the window, Rachel spotted Emma sitting on the porch steps, head bent close to her friends as they shared secrets and laughter. The sight made her heart swell. Just months ago, she'd arrived here broken and desperate, clutching a deed bought with her last pennies. Now, the cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing for both her family and the community. Ranger patted faithfully at her heels as she made her way outside, greeting visitors with his gentle demeanor. Children reached to pat his head, and he accepted their attention with dignified patience. He'd become as much a part of the cabin's story as the glowing walls, the loyal companion who'd first discovered its secrets. As afternoon mellowed into evening, the crowd thinned. Those who remained gathered on the wide porch, sharing coffee and homemade cookies as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Emma's laughter rang out clear and untroubled, a sound Rachel had feared she might never hear again after the divorce. Margaret dozed in her chair, a peaceful smile on her face. Her daughter's photo rested in her lap, the one of her as a baby, held by her mother Helen, with James standing proud in his uniform. The image that had started it all, bringing truth to light after 70 years of silence. Rachel leaned against the porch railing, watching fireflies begin their evening dance in the gathering dusk. Their tiny lights winked in and out like stars fallen to earth, matching the gentle pulse of the cabin's walls. Ranger stretched out at her feet, his watchful eyes scanning the twilight shadows out of habit. A warm breeze carried the scent of wild roses from the garden they'd planted in Helen's memory. Behind them, the cabin's glow strengthened as darkness fell, its light a gentle reminder of James Carter's enduring love for his family. "Some homes are bought with money," Rachel whispered, her words carried away by the evening wind. "Others, with love. This one was given by both." The fireflies continued their dance in the purple dusk, their lights merging with the cabin's gentle radiance. Around her, the sounds of quiet conversation and contentment filled the air, a testament to how one man's devotion had created not just a home, but a legacy of hope and light that would shine on through generations. If even one moment stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story, written gently for the heart.